Good day, everybody, and welcome to this IISS webinar on climate change and weaponization of natural resources, part of our climate briefing series. My name is Irene Mia. I'm Senior Fellow for Latin American Conflict Security and Development at the IISS. I'm also the editor of the Armed Conflicts Survey series, which is one of the annual flagship publication of the Institute. I'm very pleased today to be the chair of this event on an increasingly timely and important issue. I'm very excited to hear from our stellar panel of speakers, but also to engage with the audience, which is particularly numerous today. Climate change is accelerating, and in our work at the Conflict Security and Development Program at the IISS, we are seeing over and over how climate change intersects and exacerbates root causes of conflict in the global south and beyond. We have also seen how ever more scarce, precious natural resources have been driving intrastate and interstate conflicts and have increasingly been instrumentalized by both state and non-state actors in pursuit of strategic and tactical goals. Natural resources have been and are increasingly used as target and tool of war, as well as bargaining tool during and after conflicts to extract concession and gain legitimacy with local population and potential allies. Today's conversation will revolve around this topic, specifically the weaponization of natural resources, including water, lands, and food, among others. We will be looking at internal conflicts, but also at the geostrategic and geopolitical issues around resource competition in the world. We will be discussing shortcomings of and gaps in international humanitarian law and international cooperation for political attention. We will also explore possible early warning methods to identify conflict areas, location, or states most at risk of resource weaponization, and also multilateral solution to strengthen the protection of natural resources and prevent their violent instrumentalization and conflicts. It is quite a lot to cover, I know, in 1 hour, but we see that as only the beginning of a conversation. We are looking forward to engaging with you all in the audience and of course with our speakers on this very important topic, which will be actually one of the features of our upcoming Armed Conflict Survey 2022. The main focus of the report next year is going to be climate security in different elements. Climate security, it is one of the focus of research at the Conflict Security and Development Program I lead at the IISS, but also for the IISS in general. So expect to hear much more from us on this topic. So I'm joined today by a fantastic panel of experts, which I will briefly introduce now in the order of remarks. So we are joined today by Laura Berkman, who is Senior Strategic Analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and is also the head of the Climate Security Program there. She leads a range of projects focusing on the security implication of climate change and represents her institute in the Water, Peace and Security Partnership that looks to pioneer the development of innovative tools and services that help identify and address water-related security risk, which we hope to hear more later on in the panel. We're also joined by Dr. Marcus King, who is John Ho ranking as Associate Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Elliott School Master of Art in International Affairs program. During the Clinton administration, he held the presidential appointment in the Secretary of Defense, where he represented the US negotiation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. He's also served as a Globalization Planning Fellow in Georgetown University Office of the President, and he's a member of the Center for Climate and Security Advisory Board. We are also followed by Dr. Susanne Schmeier, who is Associate Professor of Water Law and Diplomacy at IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. Susanne research, teaching, and advisory activities focus includes the legal and institutional dimension of water resource management at both the subnational and transboundary level. Susanne also leads the Water, Peace and Security Partnership I alluded earlier on when I introduced Laura. And last but not least, Mark Nevitt, who is an Associate Professor of Law at Syracuse University College of Law, where he teaches different courses related to law and also natural resources and climate change law. Mark has served as Distinguished Professor of Leadership and Law at the US Naval Academy in an Annapolis, very hard to pronounce for me. Before that, he also served as Sherwood Fellow, lecturer in law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. We're also joined today by my dear colleague, Erika Pepe, who is a senior coordinator for research and also research analyst at the IISS. She will give a brief presentation on the topic ahead of the introductory speaking point by the speakers, and also help me moderate the Q&A today, which promises to be very busy given that we have a record number of participants. Before we start, just a final note on housekeeping. We welcome questions from the audience, and we will try to make this discussion as interactive and as inclusive as possible. To that end, if you could please add your questions, comments on the Q&A box. We will pick them up in the course of the panel and also in the Q&A section at the end of the panel. So let's start the conversation with a round of introductory remarks by our speaker, and then we open the floor for discussion. Before that, Erika, if you want to say a couple of words to introduce the topic, please.
Thank you very much, Irene. I wanted just to introduce the topic because the relationship between climate change and conflict is complex and crosses over with economic, political, and social factors. Over the past years, though, climate change has been internationally recognized as a threat to peace and security, and as an accelerator of conflicts. And we are discussing weaponization today because the physical effects of climate change, such as droughts and desertification, as well as sudden onset natural disasters, such flooding, is increasing the pressure on the availability and usability of natural resources. And this offers, as you also said, increasing opportunities for state and non-state actors to instrumentalize and exploit these resources to their advantage and as a weapon. Key natural resources such as water and land have often been targeted and weaponized as part of strategies to seize and maintain power and influence. However, the forecasted effects of climate change on local and regional weather are expected to make some of these resources even more scarce, difficult to manage, and more contentious. And this is expected not only to exacerbate cross-border geopolitical flashpoints, as you will see with Laura's presentation, and also increase the potential for conflict over competition for scarce natural resources, but also it makes the control of natural resources more strategic, and it makes the use of this as a weapon even more effective to exert domination and legitimacy. And in the upcoming years, this has the potential to have greater adverse effects on human security and on the global security environment compared to the previous decades. So the changing weaponization dynamics in this context of climate change require a better understanding of the relationship between the increasing pressure of climate change on resources, mostly in a fragile and unstable environment, particularly in those areas where climate-related effects reduce the state capacity. And also it requires an understanding of the dynamics of the weaponization of these resources, as we will see in the discussion in the panel. And the discussion, I think, will be crucial because it's crucial to understand and identify conflict areas most at risk of resources weaponization, and to address the difficulty to find effective multilateral solutions and strategies of intervention in this field, as you were saying, to prevent and mitigate and address the issue of weaponization of these resources. So it is there is a great need for further discussion, and we look forward to hearing our experts' view on these challenges.
Thanks, Erika. Laura, if I can start with you, could you help us actually setting the scene for the topic, also focusing on the international geopolitical overview of the different ways in which states leverage resources more generally for power? Please, Laura.
Yes, thank you, Irene and Erika. Thank you to the IISS for this opportunity to speak in today's panel. As stated, I will provide a higher level geopolitical perspective on today's topic and zoom in on how natural resources may be used by states for geostrategic impact. In my intervention, I will elaborate on three main points. Firstly, I will clarify the link between climate change and natural resource weaponization. in the context of interstate dynamics and provide some examples of how this presents geostrategic opportunities at the state level. Second, I will discuss some of the implications of resource weaponization by states on human security, state level stability, but also identify some of these potential spillover risks and threats for the global security environment. And third and finally, I will try and provide some ideas and thoughts about the significance of interstate competition for natural resources for the evolving geopolitical landscape. So to start with that first question, what is the link between climate change and natural resource weaponization, and what are some of the geostrategic opportunities this brings at the state level? Well, the increasing frequency of extreme weather events and natural disasters resulting from climate change directly impact the quantity and quality of natural resources such as water and food. Since the physical effects of climate change are projected to worsen with projected increases in global warming, this will naturally lead to further shortages of water and food in many regions around the world, and some regions in particular. This will make natural resources an increasingly attractive strategic and tactical instrument for states to develop a competitive advantage, pursue vital economic or military interests and political interests, and consolidate power and legitimacy. And this is especially the case in regions where states are vulnerable and lack social, political, and economic structures to cope with what we call the burdens of climate change. However, I also want to touch upon this phenomenon under conditions of accelerating climate change, not just limited to water and food in fragile countries, but also to the broader geopolitical context. Energy, for example, has been used as a strategic and tactical weapon for great power competition for many, many decades. For example, the current conflict in Europe between Russia and the Ukraine is fueled quite literally by natural gas dependency of Europe and Germany in particular on Russia. With over 40% of its natural gas coming from Russia, Germany and a number of other EU member states have been quite reluctant to develop economic sanctions against Russia, severely hampering a strong European response to Russia's assertive and threatening stance against the Ukraine and its demands for NATO to remove its troops on the eastern flanks of Europe. While the US, EU, the UK, and NATO have banded together in support of the Ukraine, Russia has asserted its friendship and strategic alliance with China. China now openly supports Russia's demands on NATO after concluding a lucrative and exclusive long-term agreement with Russia on the delivery of natural gas to China. And China's involvement is not trivial. So if NATO and the US fail in the Ukraine, it is likely that the Chinese might test the US resolve in Taiwan in the Pacific in the near future. I present this example because it shows how energy can also be used as a weapon and a target in terms of gaining geostrategic advantage, and is very much a reality today. So new geopolitical hotspots are emerging as climate change is melting polar ice caps in the Arctic and presenting new economic and strategic opportunities for trade and the extraction of oil and natural gas and minerals. But who has the right to control these seaways and benefit from the vast and undiscovered natural resource deposits? This is an evolving geopolitical concern. Antarctica will emerge also as a major geopolitical hotbed in the future with its own vast reserves of oil and gas, and critically, as holder of the world's largest freshwater reserve in the world. So the current mining ban in Antarctica expires in 2048, which is a time in the future when fresh water will likely be even more highly sought after as a result of further climate-induced water scarcity, but also it will be potentially a critical year for the Chinese Communist Party in its efforts to realize its ambition to be one of the world's most developed and powerful nations by its centenary in 2049. These are the kinds of developments where you can see that certain geostrategic interests will come at play. So what are the implications for human security, state-level stability, and the potential spillover risks and threats for the global security environment? Fragile nations with weak governmental institutions are less likely to act decisively, let alone preemptively, to help its population secure access to water, food, but also energy resources essential for their survival. And this has serious human security and state stability implications. Lack of access to vital resources affects livelihoods and forces people to respond, either by protesting against the ruling government, moving elsewhere, or seeking alternative or even illicit ways to make a living. States that are in a position to control access to these vital natural resources can leverage their power influence by supporting governing elites or non-state groups in their exploitation of scarce natural resources. But they can also do it by putting more pressures on local communities or by creating more interstate dependency. A good example of this is also quite a long-standing development that China is involved in with the Belt and Road Initiative, which was initiated in 2013. As of last year, 140 countries and 32 international organizations have signed cooperation agreements as part of this initiative. And rather than viewing it as an ambitious capacity building project for countries interested in developing their economies, it is also seen by many as an effort to develop an expanded interdependent market for China, to grow its economic and political power, and to create the right conditions for setting the standards to build a high technology economy. So in addition to these physical impacts on the availability of water, food, and energy, state responses to climate change and the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions will also lead to new interstate competition to control resources and dominate the technologies needed for the clean energy transitions. However, these transitions won't happen overnight. It will be painful, it will take a long time, and it will affect some countries much harder than others. As the transition to this greener global economy is still in its infancy, the use of fossil fuels is actually set to continue as countries struggle to change their energy mixes to greener alternatives. Third and finally, what is the significance of natural resource weaponization for the evolving geopolitical landscape? Natural resources will continue to be used as strategic or tactical tools to leverage state and non-state powers around the world. Moving forward, the scarcity of natural resources, such as food and water, is likely set to increase, and great powers will play their role in determining the impact on human security, as fragile countries will be at the mercy of foreign support for conflict prevention, adaptation measures, and migratory pressures. Climate change and responses to climate change will also be a key driver of geostrategic competition. The climate mitigation battle to reduce global warming and the transition to cleaner forms of energy will alter the geopolitical landscape. And there will be winners and losers to this transition, leading to growing divisions between developing and developed states, petrostates and non-petrostates, and the great powers, specifically China and the United States. The winners and losers of this energy transition will likely be different in the short, medium, and longer term, depending on the phase of that transition. And so we will see that some petrostates will benefit in the short term, as fossil fuels will remain part of the energy mix, and other states will continue to be reliant on oil and gas for their consumption. As states cannot leverage traditional energy resources for power and influence moving forward, they might resort to other means to influence interstate relations. One way to gain more control over climate-related pressures is through the deployment of geoengineering technologies. This will also likely be a game changer, as it could put state and non-state actors that master these technologies in a position to deliberately and unilaterally intervene in the Earth's climate system. The risks and unintended consequences of deploying such technologies are still unclear, but it could definitely and potentially be used as a weapon by controlling weather patterns, their intensity, and who may be affected by it. The international community still lacks a meaningful governance dialogue on geoengineering. So states that will have access to those resources required to influence the speed and the direction of the energy transition will likely come out on top. I'll leave my remarks here to leave room for the other speakers and engage more in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. That was fascinating. It's really interesting how the great power competition over natural resources also intersect with internal dynamics. And on that note, if I can turn to Marcus now, can you share with us some insight on the dynamics of resource weaponization by both state and non-state actor, based on your work on Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Nigeria, please?
Yes, thank you. So I'll focus mostly on the weaponization of water, and it relates to about a 5-year project that I've been working on, including a book that I now have in press on extremist groups and their use of the water weapon, but especially under conditions of a climate-induced drought that swept across Middle East and North Africa, both in 2011 and 2017. So what I found in my work was that there's 6 ways in which extremist groups, but also by extension, state actors can also weaponize water. So the first is on a strategic level. And so that would be something like using water to inundate large or important areas or infrastructure, as well as population centers. For example, when dams are seized, it gives the perpetrators virtual control over wide swaths of territory. Also, on the tactical level, water can be used to destroy, disable, or deny access to targets in a battle space. And these targets could be primarily of military value. Another type of weaponization is really using water as an instrument of psychological terrorism. This would be threatening to withhold or contaminate water supplies and to create fears among non-combatant groups. And similarly, it can be an instrument of extortion or incentivization, where providing or denying water is used to achieve compliance or to punish subjected populations while building legitimacy of the perpetrator. Finally, water can also be used in sort of an unintentional way, where attempting water weaponization really has unintended collateral damage to the environment or to local populations. So on the state level, there's a related concept that I wanted to touch on, which is called hydrohegemony or hydrohegemonic behavior. So this is not exactly weaponization, but this is where states might use water as a political lever or a tool of influence, especially within a riparian system. So an example of this would be China. They have a stronghold on the Mekong River system, where they're putting pressure on what's known as the lower riparians or the downstream states. So there's been particularly dry seasons in the last 2 years, probably due to climate change. There are 11 Chinese mega dam projects, which are upstream, storing as much as 50 billion cubic meters of water. And they're in control of the downstream reaches. And also China, as part of their Belt Road Initiative, which I think Laura had mentioned, are providing financing for more dams. Again, the environmental issues have caused shrinkage of Tonle Sap Lake, which is the largest concentration of food and fish resources in the area, and causing food insecurity in places like Cambodia and Vietnam. So this is an idea of how water can be used as a lever also on the state level. Throughout history, water weaponization has been what I would call an ancient, but not necessarily a frequent practice. Water has actually more often been a catalyst for cooperation than for conflict, going back to 2,500 years ago to Mesopotamian civilizations. But those civilizations themselves were something that we refer to as hydraulic empires. And so what they did was they based their powers on manipulating water resources to subjugate populations. We also saw during the Roman Empire, there were tactics of destroying levees. There were tactics of throwing dead bodies down wells. 17th century, during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the Dutch again breached levees. So this is more of a common manifestation in modern warfare of water weaponization, where there's deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure. And this also happened during the Korean War, but not as much during the Vietnam War, when this was abandoned for reasons which I'm sure Professor Nevitt will get into, which is that it is illegitimate under laws of war, environmental treaties, and the such. So I wanted to give some examples of weaponizing water, both on the state level and on the sub-state level. So one that really strikes me was from the work I've done was in 1991, actions of Saddam Hussein, who drained the southern marshes. And this action was undertaken primarily for political ends, namely to force the marsh Arabs who out of their areas through water diversion tactics, and also to punish them for a role in an uprising against the state in 1991. So this action displaced 200,000 marsh Arabs and was associated with a state-sponsored campaign of violence that then led to accusations of ecocide, of ethnic cleansing. And it was described by the United Nations as on par with deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, which was one of the worst environmental disasters of the 20th century and continues today. On a tactical level, another example comes from the work that I've done, and I want to turn to Somalia. There was an event in 2018 where American Special Forces were working along with a group called AMISOM, which was sponsored under the UN, on a multi-day operation in an area called the Juba River, where the Americans were trying to establish a permanent combat outpost. And in response to this, Al-Shabaab diverted water from the Juba River in an area they had under surveillance, and they forced military forces of the United States to move to an unplanned location about 2 kilometers away. What happened was Al-Shabaab was then able to set an ambush, killing an American soldier and wounding others. So this was significant, an incident I found, because it was the first time where US forces were actually had to change their operational plan on the ground in Somalia, where they found themselves at a disadvantage. So this is an idea of tactical weaponization. And I'd say the preeminent example, again, by a non-state actor, so we're looking at actions of ISIS in this case, was the seizure in 2014 of the Mosul Dam. 3-kilometer long dam on the Tigris River upstream of Mosul City, and ultimately of Baghdad itself. And the destruction of the dam could have cost the lives of large numbers of civilians, threatening US personnel and facilities below what's known as the Green Zone. And this again gave ISIS this virtual control of a large area or a large territory due to the threats they had on it. And so the accounts that I studied suggested that this action provided the primary motivation of the United States to do airstrikes as a new tactic in support of Iraqi and Kurdish forces on the ground. This was a pitched battle that involved 35 airstrikes in the end of it. And so what this really did was prove that ISIS could use water as a strategic instrument. But what it did is accelerated the conflict, bringing a new actor into the war, the United States, a new type of warfare, the aerial campaign, into the fray for the first time. So my findings were that Islamic State weaponized water, and of course that precipitated US involvement. But overall, water was really a critical enabler of ISIS during their war campaign. And so by implication, denial of extremist groups' ability to use the water weapon would be an important part of counterinsurgency strategies for the United States or any other countries that would intervene. So again, I think what the responsibility would be of the international community is to prevent water weaponization from becoming more of a norm in international warfare. And so I believe from my work that extremist groups, unfortunately, have seen it spread. There's some indications in Burkina Faso, for example, where there's also issues of farmer-herder violence due to lack of water, where we're seeing extremist groups being able to seize on that. We've seen also in Yemen, there's been deliberate destruction of civilian water infrastructure by the Saudi-led coalition. So I think indications are that it's a practice that's spreading, but it is legitimate, and there's many other prohibitions surrounding water as a particularly ugly and impermissible thing to weaponize. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing more about how that can be prevented.
Thanks, Marcus. That was a fantastic overview on and with all those really real life experience, which I think are really adding to our knowledge and to the conversation. Building on what you were saying in terms of really mechanism and gaps, I would say, in international humanitarian law regarding this misuse of natural resources. Suzanne, if I can turn to you, I would say, can you actually elaborate a little bit on what are the limitations, what are the gaps in international mechanism or international humanitarian law in addressing actually those weaponization of natural resources, and what can be done to actually enforce humanitarian law in that respect?
Thanks, Irene. And thanks for the two previous speakers for really paving the ground. I'd like to start exactly where Marcus was ending, and I'd like to reiterate, maybe in a slightly different way than Marcus did, that there are actually two different ways to look at the link between water or environment or natural resources and conflict. One, I would say, is water or natural resources being a reason or a trigger, or quite often actually a multiplying factor in conflict. So that's something where I, for example, would situate the Mekong example that was given. So competition over resources or unilateral development of resources leading to conflict between states. And the other side being the effects that violent conflict can have on natural resources, on the environment, and on water. So, for example, the Iraq, Syria examples that were mentioned, I think, are really great examples for this. And if we look at these two things as sort of distinct yet overlapping, and I'll come to the overlap in a bit, we can see that there are also two different fields of law that deal with it. We have humanitarian law, to some extent also international criminal law, that deals with the dimension that relates to the use or the effects of water or the environment in armed conflict. So either intentional, weaponization in narrow in terms, or collateral damage as in unintentional. And then we have, so that's being dealt with in humanitarian law. And then we have international environmental law, which deals more with the question of preventing or mitigating conflicts around natural resources and the environment. If we look at humanitarian law first, we do have some, a lot of people would argue not enough, provisions in international humanitarian law that have developed, especially since the 1970s. We have the 1977 Protocol number 1 to the Geneva Convention, which we also have, let me add that first, the 1997 NMOD Convention, so the Convention on the Prohibition of Military and any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques, environmental modification clearly being inspired here by the Vietnam War, and a few other instruments, including, for example, Article 8 of the statute, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. All those come from an angle that looks at what affects the destruction or negative effects on the environment caused by violent conflict would have on humans. So it is, as the name humanitarian law obviously says, a very human focus, and it tries to regulate or to limit the way belligerent parties could use natural resources such as water in their warfare. We can see quite a few shortcomings when it comes to that field of law that have been criticized. For example, the fact that it's international law, so by default applies, at least originally, some changes have been done there, but applies largely to states. So Marcus was mentioning the non-state actors. So here we do have a challenge, and it applies largely to interstate war. And also, as the examples that Marcus was giving clearly showed that this is not always the case when we do see the weaponization of water and other resources these days. So quite a few challenges here that I think still need to be addressed. There have been some promising advances. For example, there have been movements to actually include ecocide in the statute of the International Criminal Court as a crime under Article 8 itself. Now environmental issues are included in war crimes, but actually adding ecocide in addition to genocide and to others. But these developments have not come very far, but there is some movement in in the field, however, with the shortcomings that I mentioned. And then turning to the other dimension that I referred to, international environmental law, here we have a legal regime that tries to prevent or mitigate conflict over resources, ideally before that leads to violence, and very rarely actually only addresses questions of natural resources and environmental management in the context of violence. To give you an example of one of the very rare exceptions, it's the 1997 UN Watercourses Convention, which actually includes an article that specifically mentions that even in times of violent and armed conflict, international watercourses are to be protected under the required or under the respective international legal principles. But here it's clearly the focus on managing resources in a way that they don't lead to violence or to conflict. Again, a number of shortcomings here. We just need to look around us in the world today. Clearly, environmental law hasn't been as effective as many of us would have probably hoped for. What I do find interesting is that we probably will see in the future much more of an overlap and synergies between these two fields of law, simply because how things develop in the world, this is something that's required. And Laura and Marcus, with the examples that they gave, alluded to it already. As we will see, especially in the context of climate change, conflict being triggered or intensified more and more often by natural resources, by the environment, by water resources, for example. Not only could that lead to more conflict, but also does that give situations or provides opportunities for actors to then actually use natural resources in the conflicts that they got into as a weapon. You can imagine that populations in particularly water scarce countries caused by man-made water mismanagement or by climate change are also particularly vulnerable to then water being used as a weapon. So that kind of intensifies the, let me not call it effectiveness, but the incentives for certain groups to use these as a weapon. So we do see an increasing overlap, which I think needs to be addressed, and which I would hope that international humanitarian law, international criminal law also, and international environmental law would try to address together. But, and that's my last remark, what I think is increasingly also important beyond very scholarly legal discussions on which field of law should influence which other field, is an improved knowledge of why, where, and how such conflicts actually happen, and thereby also thinking beyond the old traditional interstate conflicts that only involve state actors. So a better understanding or a better idea of where conflict can be triggered, be it conflict for any reason or conflict for environmental and natural resources reasons, because only that will help us to know when environmental resources, water resources could potentially be used as a weapon, and then allow the international community to intervene in a preventive manner. And I'll leave it to that.
Thanks, Suzanne. That was great, and I actually can see that there are lots of questions obviously on the prevention, but also on the enforcement side and what can be done. And in this sense, I would like to turn the floor to Mark, really to following on Suzanne's remarks. What could be the multilateral solution to really strengthen the protection of natural resources and prevent their violent instrumentalization? Also looking at the question, is there a role for the UN Security Council in that? Please, Mark, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you for IISS for this really important topic. I hope it's the first of many. And let me just say, I want to co-sign to all the remarks by Suzanne, Marcus, and Laura. I completely agree with all my colleagues' comments ahead of time. And then the question is, what can be done about this really challenging problem from a legal standpoint? And I think it's important to first frame the issue. And I think that Laura, Marcus, and Suzanne framed it quite well. From a lawyer's perspective, I would say that there's definitely two issues going on. One is just direct natural resource conflict that's occurring between nation states, which can lead to armed conflict. This has been a source of tension for millennia. This, of course, has been exacerbated by climate change, and it's also further complicated by non-state actors. The second framing, which I think is the more interesting one, the one that's gotten the most attention, is just sort of indirect natural resource conflict and instability, where food insecurity, water insecurity leads to political instability. This is directly exacerbated by climate change, where climate change may not necessarily be the leading cause of conflict, but it is helping to set the conditions for instability. And that's relatively novel in the last 20 to 30 years. We've always had natural resource conflicts, but this is relatively novel. I completely agree with Suzanne in the sense that the body of law we start looking at is international environmental law. There are just a host of issues with enforcement of international environmental law writ large, even though there are no shortage of treaties, binding and non-binding commitments. Just enforcing international environmental law, even on the best of circumstances, is pretty challenging. And then this subject in natural resource weaponization, I think, makes it even more challenging. So before I get to the solutions, and I have some ideas on this, let me just sort of highlight just two questions, because I think that's really important to sort of understand the really important questions before we get to what can be done about it. The first question, I think, is what has the United Nations done on this subject, and what could they do? That starts, I think, with the discussion of the Security Council, the P5 members, permanent 5 members, and there is a chat question from Valeria, who's a student in Rome, on this. But as you know, it's China, United States, France, UK, and Russia. What we see, of course, is that the Security Council, when they address climate issues, and they've shown an increased willingness to do so, they do not do so in a silo. So all the other geopolitical baggage from outside the climate negotiations is brought to the Security Council. But the Council does have the legal authority and responsibility, not just authority, but responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security under Article 24. So again, if indeed natural resource weaponization undermines peace and security, what can the Security Council do about it? The Security Council has not made a formal threat to international peace and security determination under Article 39 of the Charter, but there's been a trend towards that. I'll just note that there's a larger history, even before climate, of council engagement and UN engagement on just ecological issues. It dates back to 1991, when Saddam Hussein burned oil fields and weaponized oil fields during the first Iraq War. Council did pass a resolution that said that Iraq was liable under international law for direct loss, damage, and depletion of natural resources. So a prescriptive duty imposed upon Iraq, difficult to collect upon, but the Council seeing the problem of ecological harm. That was followed up in 1992, where the Council acknowledged that ecological and social issues could constitute threats to international peace and security. Kofi Annan in 2005 highlighted this by saying that the threats to peace and security in the 21st century include just not international war and conflict, but also environmental degradation. I think this sort of set the conditions for the first time the Council began thinking about climate change, which was 2007, when they started to address climate security via open forums and debates amongst the Council, sort of just trying to wrap their heads around what role does a Council have in addressing climate security. The 2011, there's a presidential statement that acknowledged climate change's potential to aggravate existing threats to international peace and security, and it highlighted climate change's impact on sea level rise in small island developing states. This led, I think, in 2015, of course, to the Paris Agreement, where everyone is aware of. And it's important to note that the one-time security is mentioned in the Paris Agreement is in the context of food security, where the Paris Agreement acknowledges that it's important to safeguard food security right there in the opening part of its statement. We saw a watershed moment, I believe, in 2017. I'm walking through the timeline because it's important to sort of understand where we go from here, where climate change was placed in a UN Security Council resolution for the first time in its history. It specifically connected climate change's impacts to a conflict area in Africa in 2017. This was followed up in 2018, where the Security Council recognized climate change's destabilizing effects in Somalia, Darfur, West Africa, and the Sahel. And just 6 weeks ago, this was built up to a formal discussion and debate to the Security Council as does indeed climate change amount to a threat to international peace and security which would trigger really important authorities beyond just being an important signaling effect. That failed in December of 2021, just 2 months ago. Russia vetoed that, China abstained, but I would say it's a complicated vote because there are many nations supported it. And the two nations that brought it forward were Ireland and Nigeria. So very kind of sort of a developing nation, developed nation. So I think that Security Council involvement is unclear, but the trend I think is unmistakable that you can trace back to 1991 to present, where there's increased engagement in just environmental ecological issues. And I will say that it's difficult to see the US and Russia geopolitically coming to agreement on climate today in light of what's happening in the Ukraine. It's just impossible to sort of just put out all the noise associated with other geopolitical issues. So the second question, I'll just be very brief on this, is I think, okay, so complicated issue, where should we focus our efforts? Where should we focus our efforts? And scholars, researchers, and the intelligence community have started to wrestle with the where question beyond just the United Nations and Security Council. I will highlight to the listeners that in the United States, several climate security reports came out last year. And one report in particular, the US intelligence estimate on climate change and security, starts getting at this question of where should we be focusing our efforts. It got a fair amount of attention in the United States. I think it should get more attention in the international realm because it'll help focus resources and maybe help focus, certainly in the Department of Defense and in the US, will help focus our attention. It highlights two what's called arcs of vulnerability, one being Central Africa, no surprise there, in light of the Security Council resolutions, and the second being Pacific small island developing states. I think that the small island developing states is a particularly challenging issue because some estimates are that some large portions of them may be uninhabitable by mid-century. So this really strikes the core of the UN system, which is predicated on the sovereign equality of all its members. So if you have a nation which is suffering from territorial integrity loss, which is leading to potential nation extinction, that really strikes at the heart of the UN system, and you'll be looking for governance solutions to address that. It also, so beyond the Central Africa and small developing states, I would, in some of my writing, I've had a third, and we can talk about that maybe in Q&A, which is the Arctic, which is the one example. We always talk about natural resources in the context of developing nations, poor nations. The Arctic is surrounded by very, very wealthy nations, Denmark, Russia, United States, Norway, Canada, but the opening of the Arctic, due to climate change, you're seeing increased potential for militarization and weaponization. So I'll just conclude there. I don't have the solutions, but I think these questions will help get you started. What has the United Nations done? What can it do to address this issue? And where should we focus our efforts? And in chat, I'll put a link to that national intelligence estimate so you can look at it, because it really, really does a good job of starting that discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That was actually great. Also, because one of the questions I see, also we have many questions. It's really around what are the next vulnerability hotspot, or you know how, and obviously it's important to prevent, but it's also important to identify what is coming, and then obviously all the question on the enforcement and all the limitation that both you and Suzanne have highlighted are really something that needs to be taken into consideration for policy action. So we have 10 minutes left, which I think it's of course I think we have actually addressed most of the question we have in the chat box, but just for kind of really focus on what we have seen as being one of the most interesting bits in terms of the prevention, in terms of, is there a way to actually identify indicators or, you know, a mechanism to address what are the main possible hotspots and what are the water security or, you know, resource security indeed weak point. So I just wanted to go back to what I have alluded in the presentation of Suzanne and Laura, and this really interesting early warning system for water-related security that the Water, Peace and Security project has put together. So I was wondering whether Suzanne, and also with some input from Laura, could just say a couple of words of this system. And then I would actually think that it'd be good to conclude with some general discussion of what we all see are the most fragile areas to watch. And also Mark has already identified 3 of them. Please, Suzanne.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Irene. As I was saying earlier, I think a key step to actually addressing or doing something about this increasing risk of a weaponization of natural resources, including water, is to actually know where conflict is happening or is likely to happen over the next few months, not too far in the future, as attention by policymakers can also be limited. If we're talking something's happening 4 years down the road, we might not get that much attention. But this is exactly what the Water, Peace and Security Partnership tries to do. If you could go to the next slide, please. We have developed an early warning system. It's a system that helps you to identify areas at the second administrative level, actually, in a country where we do see an increased likelihood of either a conflict continuing over the next 12 months or a conflict emerging. And this is based on a machine learning tool that processes a huge number of variables with a particular focus on water, food, and energy security. And as I said, aims to identify where conflict is likely to happen, but combines that also with additional information, for example, on areas that are experiencing drought, but also specific conflicts that have happened in the past. Knowing that the best predictor for future conflict is previous conflict, and the best predictor for the future use of water, for example, as a weapon, is probably also that has happened before. I mean, Marcus was providing some examples how also repeatedly ISIS and others have, for example, been using water as a weapon. So this is what we try with the Water, Peace and Security Partnership. If you could just go to the next slide, we do totally see that this is really only a first step. So we can only really identify places where we think conflict is likely to happen, and therefore there might also be an increased risk of the use of water or also energy or food resources as a weapon. But if we want to know more, we actually need to engage in local analysis, and this is just a few examples here of what we've been doing and how we approach this. So we're trying to actually model not only the water, food, and energy situation in the country, specifically through local analysis, but also engage with local actors in what we call a human response modeling. So trying to understand exactly what responses humans, different ethnic groups, different communities, but also different governorates or provinces, for example, will take in relation to a certain, let's say, water-related threat. And that could include, for example, using water as a weapon, or using water in a way to gain control over certain areas, or the water itself for certain economic interests. If you can just go to the next slide, and I think you need to click a bit through, yeah, because there was exactly. So if you just want to know more, and that's the end of this short commercial break, just go to the Water, Peace and Security website, and we'd be happy to hear more from you.
That's actually great. Is this something that is going to be updated, or is it updated kind of in real time? So
it's updated in real time, and every 3 months we issue a forecast that you can also receive by email or listen to our podcast if you want regular updates.
Yeah, I think those tools are actually really interesting for prevention. And yes, Erica, what do you want to?
Yes, I just wanted to add that the discussion is really fascinating and is generating many questions and debate. I just wanted to ask Suzanne about the fact that with the early warning systems, the issue sometimes it is that the early warning is not transformed into specific preventive responses. And I know that you mentioned that engaging with local population, for example, is crucial to have some specific responses. But I wanted to ask whether you think the warning can better be linked to responses, and whether there are some best practices in cases that you have studied.
Yeah, I think you're actually alluding to the key point that probably all of us working on the more research side have been frustrated with. There is so much knowledge out there in terms of where conflict is happening or is likely to happen and where that's going to happen, and there's so little action, especially timely and targeted action, in which policymakers in a country or from the global community would actually address this. So I think that's a key thing that we all together, I would hope, would be working on, translating our knowledge into policy action. I think we do see an increasing awareness. Mark was talking about the UN Security Council. There has also recently been a study specifically by UN Water looking into the capacity of the UN system to leverage water for peace, looking into what the UN can do also on the humanitarian development and the water side. So I think this is increasingly acknowledged, but generally the science policy gap that we see between what we know and what action is then taken, I think is the key challenge.
Yeah, and I guess that's really the key challenge of really use all the tools and all the information we have to actually have better prevention, but also better policy responses. I think in the few minutes we have, it'd be great. I mean, I just want to give each of you like 2 minutes and really just to tell us either, you know, what's actually worrying you the most. What is what are the areas where, you know, you expect more weaponization of resources, but in general more competition interstate or interstate regarding resources. And really, what would be the priority? I think 2 minutes is very short, but I think would be useful to actually have a final round, starting with maybe Laura, as in the order we had in the beginning.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. I think many of the other speakers have already provided some excellent sort of pointers as to where you know, these sort of risks or where these pressures are likely to be felt in the most. Perhaps just building on my perspective for this panel, which is kind of a higher level, I think that it's commonly assumed, if you look at, you know, the competition around natural resources and specifically around energy, that the greener sort of transition will have kind of this positive sort of impact on certain interstate competitions that are currently in place, i.e. a lot of what we call petrostates would be less influential, and therefore you would get to a more kind of balanced system where there wouldn't be as many autocratic regimes sort of forcing their agenda. I don't think this is true. I think that we will see in this transition new geopolitical patterns developing, which are similarly going to be creating high pressure points. Perhaps I can give one example, and this is a great concern, I think, as this energy transition is moving forward, is that in this sort of race towards new technologies, we're getting more and more dependencies on natural resources such as critical minerals that are only found in certain parts of the world. If you look at where these are found, you can see that a vast majority of them are being mined by China. So China is really a key player. And I think that perhaps if you broaden it out, and I believe even Mark said those words in a previous panel that I heard Mark, all roads lead to China. China is the biggest fossil fuel emitter, and therefore will, you know, continue to have some strong dependencies on fossil fuels in the short to medium term. And at the same time, it's the largest investor in the energy renewables. In other words, it will dictate kind of the pace of how fossil fuels will be kind of sort of paced down in favor of renewables, because it actually literally dominates the demand and supply side of the equation. And therefore, I think we should have more attention, and not just in terms of great power competition, but also in terms of how can we keep China on board, and how can we work with China to develop an agenda that works for them as well as for other key international players that have everything to gain by creating more stable relationships with China and other countries that are going to be strong players in this respect. I'll keep it there.
Thanks, Rado. Those are actually great points. Marcus, it was really interesting what you said earlier on, also expanding on the other way of weaponization, like what you were mentioning, the hydro hegemony, so other way to actually use resources for political gains more in general. What is in your radar? What are you the most concerned in terms of the topic and future conflicts?
Yeah, so looking at the potential for future conflicts, rather than giving specific examples, I would say, there are plenty of indices out there. There are plenty of countries that people are thinking about where there is emerging climate vulnerabilities. So thinking about those countries, this didn't come up too much, but in terms of development, alleviating the actual scarcities through development assistance, leaves, if water is being provided through development assistance, then there's less water to weaponize, for example. So it's working on abundance and doing so through development. And so thinking about things like climate finance, thinking about adaptation projects that can be done as a tool of conflict prevention. So thinking about development as a tool for conflict prevention in countries that are very vulnerable to climate change and looking around for those.
That's a great point, actually, really, really good point. And I think somebody also had made it in the chat. Just wanted to say that we have actually addressed most of the question, and also some of the questions were addressed bilaterally by some of our great speakers in typing them. So thanks so much for that as well. Suzanne and Mark, your last thought on the topic. Suzanne?
I'll just keep it very brief. I've taken enough time, and I also agree with what Laura and Marcus have said before. I think I'd just like to add that while we are making progress in better connecting the water in conflict, or the environmental resources in conflict, and the environmental resource affected by conflict discussions, and while there's also been some progress in connecting the respective legal fields, I think where we're struggling and what will be a key problem in the future is how we can actually expand that and bring that to non-state actors, and specifically also conflict that happens at all sorts of levels beyond the interstate level, not only in terms of our thinking, but in terms of actual enforcement. Because I think if we look at what happened in the last years, especially the examples that Marcus was referring to, this is going to be the key problem.
Definitely. Mark, last famous word?
Briefly, yes, I agree with Laura that there will be increasing pressure to decarbonize. I do believe that all roads lead to China, both for any sort of mitigation strategy and progress on renewable energy technology. And so that is just a transformational shift in geopolitical realities looking ahead. And I don't know if we fully have embraced that or seen that. The second thing I'll just mention is that Central America, there are 4 nations in Central America which were identified as particularly vulnerable to climate change, natural resources conflicts: El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras. In the United States, we're often very kind of domestic focused. Our politics are interesting, to put it mildly. But for the first time, we're seeing sort of the climate impacts of Central America influence immigration patterns and domestic policy in the United States. So as an American viewpoint, the climate change is becoming literally at our doorstep because of the instability and fragility in Central America. So I'm looking to see how that's going to impact domestic US politics on climate change.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really happy you mentioned Central America. It's actually something we have been quite worried in our Latin American program, which is part of CSDP at the IISS. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I think we could speak for another 2 hours. It was a fascinating conversation. Let me thank again all of you, Laura, Marcus, Suzanne, and Mark. I hope this is the beginning of many, many more conversations. Thanks so much for your insight. Thanks for the audience to be so engaged with a lot of great questions. And we're looking forward to the next climate briefing. Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.